and indigenous women, and who's an emblematic figure of the defense of environment and the women's rights, and then Alexis Marais de Grotte, who's a lawyer and a partner in a business law firm. And so I will tell you more about our speakers as their turn to speak comes. So we'll give actually the floor now to our economist Hippolyte Dalbis to start the debate. So thank you, Sabine. So it's true that this is a very interesting debate, and the answer seems to be an obvious one. But nevertheless, when we look, at the members of this debate, we can see there's two types of positions. Those who actually promote the reduction of inequalities, those who are the advocates to actually fight wealth concentration. I mean, they speak high. Nuit debout and the 1%, these types of movements, as if there were, despite this obviousness, there's a need to actually say it loud and clear and to talk in a very direct fashion. Sometimes there could be actually a pitfall. I mean, there's, so we want so much to reduce inequalities, we tend to forget about all the other topics. So any public action will be assessed in how much it actually is able to reduce the inequalities. And, with Donald Trump's election, with the Brexit, sometimes, there's a political emergency, and we've analyzed this vote, we could qualify as a populist vote, as a result of an increase of inequalities. So you have this is one side of the debate, and on the other side, you have people who may not advocate reduction of inequalities, as you said, Sabine. I mean, 8 people who have as much wealth as a 3.5 billion. I mean, difficult to agree with this, and so there's going to be another type of attitude by actually advocating the idea that this is not such an important subject. There are other issues such as globalization, technological breakthrough that are the real topics, and then they'll intervene in the debate, not by saying it's not necessary to reduce inequalities, but much more on the fact that the means that you're going to implement to reduce inequalities, they are going to have a negative effect on the economy. And so let's create wealth, and first let's create wealth, and then we'll actually redistribute the wealth. And it's always, after the fact. So faced with this this opposition and people who tend not to talk to one another, so we want to show that this is not a simple issue. We need to debate about it, and it's good that we're able to actually tackle this issue today in X. Okay, so off we go. Mr. Loïc Moutot has been working for 20 years in the Mars Group, and since 2013, and he's actually head of the Royal Canin branch. The Mars Group is both a world leader and a family-owned company, and we don't talk about employees, but partners, and so again, wealth concentration. Are businesses concerned with this? Are they responsible for this? And it's not so much about who has the capital, but what is done with this capital. Thank you, Sabine. Yes, yes. We talk of associés at Mars. So our viewpoint at Mars is the macroeconomic outlook and the role that a company can play in the creation and distribution of wealth. So there's 3 issues. The first being is that the concentration of capital or capitals is not a problem per se, and we need to actually revisit the concept of margin that's used by businesses. What is a margin? And the third point is to actually look at a company well beyond its legal format, but what its role can be outside of that, considering there are many players who interact with the company. So first, about the concentration of capital, I think the real problem is not is not about concentration per se, but it's in whose hands it lies. So we would like to introduce this concept of useful capital or not so useful capital or useless capital. When the capital is in the hands of entrepreneurs who are able to reinvest capital to create more value in the future and to actually create value. This is what I call useful capital. I think, when there's problems, and the capital is concentrated on hyper consumption or a financial speculation. And here, perhaps we can say that this is not capital that is useful to society. So our viewpoint is that the concentration of capital in itself is not a problem. Then hyper concentration is something else. But I think the question is in whose hand the capital and the capacity of the players to reinvest it for not just financial. Then there's a second issue, the margin. So an anecdote. At the beginning, there's an evolution of the word margin that actually went down the wrong road. Initially, margin was, a piece of land left by the owner to those who helped them to actually work the land, the soil, so that they themselves could live on it. And it evolved, and it became margin is what's left to me as a business, as a company, as an entrepreneur, and so give or take is I'm going to try and maximize everything I'm left with. But originally that was not it at all. So our feeling is that if you want to create value and that's sustainable and beneficial, well, what you need is that the margin generated by the value chain has to be distributed in actually fairly. I mean, we have at Mars we have what's called mutuality for profit. To be sustainable, it had to be shared with the players of the company. So we want to actually redefine the concept of margin insofar as it actually is part and parcel of value redistribution. And then the third point is the company itself, and within an ecosystem, that actually there's a lot of agents. It could be institutions, it's suppliers, it's clients, it's customers, it could be consumers. Sometimes, are at a distance. Sometimes, we supply clients that are not our final end user, and also the interaction and the employees within this ecosystem. And so all along the value chain, there's always actually a weak link. So how do you actually create solidarity within the value chain to actually reinforce the weak link so that value creation be more sustainable in the long term? So I'm going to conclude giving you an example, which my own company, Royal Canin. So this is almost anecdotal. And we make a therapeutic food for kibble for dogs and cats. And you have a dog or a cat, that has a kidney problem. We're going to actually keep it alive for very, very long, many, many years. So how do we go about it? So we work with the breeders and veterinarians that are very often family-owned businesses. And we make the most of their expertise, so we innovate thanks to their own observations. So we reinvest in the community of breeders and veterinarians. These are very expensive distribution channels, and it's easy to to sell to Intermarché or Leclerc. Very much more difficult to sell to veterinary clinics in France and to actually work along a very fine capillarity. So we invest in these networks, in these channels, and also in the scientific discovery. We want to help them become better in their own practice, as is said in English. So we participate in the investment, and because of that, our observation is that in periods of high tension, like in Ukraine, we had a military coup. Many players left, and our brand survived and continued developing. Why? Because it was provided support from the network in which we had invested, and in an informal fashion. So we are not a philanthropic company, and no ifs or buts about that. But it's the fact of reinvesting in a community here, breeders and vets, to reinvest in a human capital through knowledge and the development of expertise of the players we interact with, and to invest in the social capital of these communities. I'd like to add that we can also invest in the natural capital. How can we renovate the consumption of the natural resources we use in our company? In fact, this makes it possible to have a company that's sustainable, that creates value, and that enriches society. and with an entrepreneurship mindset. So our interpretation is that the whole management system itself has been set up since the 70s to maximize the return on capital, on equity. So we feel there are different types of capital equity. There's a financial equity that has to be shared through a redefinition of the margin. You have a human capital, and you have a social capital and a natural capital. And the major challenge we're faced with for the future is to be able to redefine the right tools to measure results, so we can redefine profitability, return on investment. We're working on this. We started in the Philippines and Kenya. We want to actually extend this in developed countries. So this is our proposal, which is a very microeconomic vision of the concentration of capitals, and I didn't say wealth. Thank you. So, Mr. Smeating, you'll tell us how you feel about what Mr. Mutu said to us, that the concentration of wealth is not a problem per se. I'd like to remind everyone that you actually lecture at a very high level. In Wisconsin University, you are multidisciplinary, and you worked a lot on the issue of income, wealth, and poverty. For 6 years, you were the director of the Institute for Research on Poverty. You also worked a lot in Luxembourg. And so we'd like to know more about this institute. What you've been working on in Europe and Luxembourg. But before that, could you give us your viewpoint about the topic of our debate? Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
I, too, am a microeconomist, but I agree with Loic that much depends on what one does with the wealth that they have. I think Mars is a wonderful corporation. I'd actually even like to work for it. It sounds very good. But I'm going to talk about a few other ones that I know. First, I want to talk a little bit about public and private wealth. Private wealth or net worth is your stock of assets, and it can be usefully split into the categories of land and homes, which are owned by a lot of people, financial assets, which are more limited, and business assets. And the concentration of the latter two was especially important. And I'm going to contrast a little bit with Loic about this. But you can't also not discuss public wealth. I mean, one of the nice things about social retirement systems and the social security systems in our countries are that if you have a large enough public sector, that actually makes a big difference to lower and middle income people. It puts a floor on their incomes. And so you can't ignore public wealth. But I mainly want to talk about private wealth. Private wealth, in my mind, is the most important indicator of well-being because of the benefits it bestows on its owners. You have the ability to self-insure your own flows of consumption and income. You have the ability to advantage your own children in every possible way to give them a better chance. A different view, a little more cynical view maybe, but an American view I know that a lot of people look at, is that what happens with a lot of corporations is they use their wealth to buy politicians. So in other words, to buy rent. So instead of producing more and better and beautiful things and saving animals and the world and nature, they buy politicians and little holes in the public distribution system so that they maintain their profitability. That's not good because they're not doing what Loic's company is doing. They're not producing better things for everybody. They're preserving their own position, and that's all. More important, I think, to what I do is the way that wealth affects mobility across generations and equality of opportunity. What happens is that a wealthy individual can ensure that his or her children have every possible advantage. And a very difficult problem that we run into in this situation is that how do you tell a parent that they can't do everything they can for their children? It's not politic, it's not rational, but if we believe that wealth accumulates excessively, and so, for instance, in the United States, the share of wealth of the top 10%, that's not small. We're talking about 15 million households. They own 80% of the net worth in the country. So I'm not talking just about the top 1%. And they can use that to their advantage and the advantage of their children. What they do is they don't support, at least in my country, further spending on health and education because they could buy their own. Why should we bother to redistribute to these other people? We can buy best education and best health systems we can find. And that really is unfortunate, I'm afraid. And it reduces mobility. That's why the United States has such low social mobility. You can contrast that with United Kingdom and France, which have lower wealth shares. Their top 10% owns about half of all net worth, which is a lot, but which is, I think, a little bit better protected. And then you can look at China, which is a very interesting case where public wealth has become private wealth, and the wealth concentration in China is very large now. The top 10% in China owns 70% of net worth. But the difference between China and the United States is that in China, there's much more shared prosperity. So the wealth begets better wages and better conditions. The peasants in China know that they're better off than their parents were under Mao and know their children will be better off. That makes a big difference. In the United States, the middle is stuck or falling. People are much less likely now to earn more than their parents, and it's not a very good situation. So we need to do more in our country to limit the bad aspects of personal wealth. And I'm afraid that the current administration isn't going to do much about this, but the idea of taxing capital income flows, stopping subsidizing wealth creation, which we do, we subsidize the top, not the bottom. I think that's wrong. But that's just my view, and I look forward to hearing the views of the others. And again, I really appreciate Loic's view, and I came behind him so I could contrast a different view of what some businesses do, at least in my country. So thank you very much.
Oui, pour ça, on pourra y revenir parce que
Yes, when you say that in China they know that their children will be better off than their children, but that's not the case in the United States. I mean, in the United States it was the case 50 years ago, 100 years ago maybe, but no longer today. Whose turn is it? So Didier is the president of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of the region Paris-Île-de-France. So the inequalities between regions will be a topic that we might touch upon. So you are also a professional of statutory auditing. So how, according to you, should we what should be our view on the topic of this debate? Should we fight wealth concentration? To be absolutely honest, I was wondering whether I had anything to do about the question, should we fight wealth concentration? So what is wealth concentration? What wealth are we talking about? Are we talking about material wealth, intellectual wealth, and so on? So this is a very vast philosophical, sociological topic. And if we want to restrict it to the economic sphere, I said this is macroeconomic, and I'm just an observer of microeconomy. Though it's true that things are not quite as simple as they may appear. And for example, okay, until 1792, and in Japan, 1950, it was the eldest son that would inherit everything, and that was actually a system to concentrate wealth because it was useful for the economic development. When it was the elder child who would actually inherit all the wealth of the parents. If an American philosopher, John Walsh, I mean, he, looked at the issue, John Ross, and he said concentration is not bad as long as certain conditions are met. And one of the two conditions is everybody has to be able to gain access to the wealth. I mean, if it's an open system, why not? So at the end of the day, the question being asked is a certain level of inequality. Is it perhaps useful as a economic development factor? And So this is a question that arises also in microeconomy when you're talking about the compensation paid by companies. And there's a debate about this. There's a pressure and there's a strong tension. Why businesses, why aren't they obliged to publish the 10 highest salaries and the 10 lowest salaries? And imagine, and to look at the ratio between the ratios 1 to 10 is satisfactory. Why 1 to 10? You know, I mean, is it the results of research? And there's a strong pressure from the social corpus, and we see in certain French public companies or non-public where the state has a participation, that there's a debate on the remuneration or compensation or the salaries of certain leaders. So when I started looking at this topic, I realized that it wasn't as simple as it seemed, because if we're just thinking of physical entities, we're not looking at the entire problem. For me, the topic has 3 levels. First is the concentration of wealth, between countries and economic regions, and there's a concentration of wealth, between actually legal entities. And it's only third, not negligible, of course, as the concentration of wealth between physical entities. But you have to look at the 2 other levels to have a complete overview of the topic. So on the first issue, so the studies that were done by economists, very remarkable and well known. I'm talking about Branko Ivanovic, and he worked on statistics that gave us the elephant graph, and he looked at the evolution of income over a 20-year period, 1998 to 2008, and look at the major economic reasons. What was the result of this? And you can see, and we can't actually show it here. And yes, you can see it's the shape of an elephant right at the bottom. You've got the tail of the elephant, and we can see that over a 20-year period, those who are unfortunate to live in countries that are not developed, so there's a very low increase of income in 20 years. That's exactly it. There's the elephant, absolutely. And very at the bottom, and at the top, the back of the elephant, 80%. Represents those people who live in the regions that did develop, that were the emerging countries, Asia, Pacific, China. Right at the bottom, it's the top of the neck. Who's there? Those are the middle class in the developed countries. That explains the reactions of these middle classes in the United States or in Europe, and they've suffered from this development. And the trump of the elephant that goes very high, that's the 1% of those who actually capture most of the wealth gained during that period. So if we just talk about this 1%, we don't see the totality of the problem. You also have to see the back of the elephant, and with an important part of the population that benefited from it. So we've been very concerned. When I was a student, and I was looking at the confrontation between North and South. We have to help people to develop themselves. So finally, it's a bit provocative to say this globalization contributed to the development and better distribution of wealth. And it was opening up the borders, and it's thanks to that certain countries benefited because they have the talents, the organizations, and the necessary infrastructures, and they were able to actually redistribute the wealth. And to answer the question you asked, well, there's still, a part of the population, that didn't benefit from this wealth. Can we correct this? Yes. If we're liberal economists, it'll happen naturally. That's what the liberal economists will think, because the progression of salaries in China is very impressive. The rise in salary. I've seen ratios that between 2005 and 2016, the average hourly wage has gone up 300%, increase of 300% in the hourly wage of Chinese and Portuguese. There's only 20% difference, because in the same period, the average income of a Portuguese worker has actually dropped. So there's been a natural correction. The opening up of the borders, globalization, has led to this. So there's a 20% difference between the hourly wage between a Chinese workman and a Portuguese worker. So when we're talking about globalization, we tend to forget to say that it can have a beneficial effect. So now let's talk about legal entities and economic development. Something strikes me.
We keep on saying we need to fight against the trusts. And in our economic space at the European Commission, there have been some operations of concentration that have been prohibited. Today, I see objectively that the GAFAs, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and so on, are a concentration. I'm not saying this just because they're American players. They are American players. That's rather curious. But, here there is one statement. You've got to fight against the concentration of wealth. But then on the other hand, you have moral persons or companies who've accumulated over the years a power through this wealth, which is quite considerable, because the economic power of those 4 economic players represent as much as the budget of Belgium, as much as all of the capitalization on the stock exchange in Paris. And that wealth is a true power, not just an economic power, but also a political power. And it might not be superfluous for us to take a closer look and demonstrate that there are other economic players who can also try and avoid this concentration, which seems rather excessive in terms of the power that it's acquired over time. And the third reflection concerning physical persons, you have all the figures. Yes, the 80 largest, most wealthy people in the world have as much money as a lot of money, and 400 economic players. What I'd like to say is that the states have the possibility of fighting against that if they want to, because they have the means of getting at this wealth with taxes, for example. And this system was very tempting, but it didn't work. So it's probably not the right solution to the problem. So how far should we push the button? It's difficult to say. But if you listen to the experts in this area, the specialists in economy, for example, you'll see that the trend today is the theory of running water. The more rich people there are, the more it's going to allow the people underneath them to benefit from this wealth. And the most recent studies from FMI have said, no, it doesn't work that way at all. And if there's a progression in the GDP, it benefits all. And this increase is allocated to everybody, from poorest to richest. I'd like to see what the economic studies say, but if there is a certain inequality in the companies, it's certainly one of the engines that drive the country. Well, it's probably a good thing to remind you that we see this concentration of wealth through just the few millionaires we have in the world, but globalization has also distributed this wealth better. Mrs. Andou Mongo Ibrahim, you're 33 years old, and it's in, oh no, and it's in 1999 that you participated in creating the Pearl Women's Association in Chad. You have a very interesting history. Your mother did everything she could to send you to school, whereas you were in a nomad environment. Despite that fact, you didn't escape from discrimination. So from then onwards, you did everything you could, I believe, to improve the living conditions of your co-citizens. And then you found that that debate was something that which could not be separated from fighting against climatic change. And you're an African representative of the fight against climate change. That's often how you're presented at any rate. So in your opinion, what impact is wealth going to have on the environment, the distribution of wealth going to have on the environment? Well, you have a lot of information on me, I see. But I'd like to say first and foremost that it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Personally, I believe that if you are talking about sharing wealth, an issue is going to be raised immediately. Who are you going to share it with? What type of wealth are you talking about? Is it cash or is it other things you're talking about? Of course, the FMI report says 5% of the world population has more than 55% of the worth. So we have a population of 4 billion. And Oxfam says 8 people have more than half of the wealth in America. So, okay, very well. What sort of wealth and who are we going to share it with? If you define poverty on international level, we talk about poverty. That's something you said earlier. These are people who live below the poverty line. But does that mean anything, whether you're wealthy or not? It depends on the concept and the definitions. What is poverty and what is wealth in people's minds, in people's life? I think that in our country, when we talk about having $5 a day, you may be poor. But if you don't say, you don't say you're poor if you have access to water and to earth, because that's what enables you to produce, and you'll have human dignity because you can have a social life. And that's what defines poverty and wealth in our country. It's not access to cash, to dollars or to money. On international level, I'd say that globalization is good for some people, perhaps, but it's not good for everybody because it doesn't enable them to define the realities of other people and where they live. And that creates inequalities between the countries, within the country, and between people. And inequalities between the countries can obviously profit to the northern countries. Let me give you an example of what I mean. The multinationals, you know all about that, who exploit the natural resources of Central Africa and who've built buildings and individual houses, millions of houses. They've even built up castles. And the natural resources are taken away from us to the rich countries. And that is dreadful, without even giving the people access to a basic education, which is something that is a basic human right. So we have a barrister with us. He knows about history better than I do. He knows how wealth is actually shared out. But on that, what I say is wealth is something that belongs to us all. The fact that we share it is something that our conscience will dictate. The natural resources of our planet are getting worse and worse, and wealth is being more and more concentrated, not by globalization, but by industrialization that has exploited our natural resources, and all the resources that remain in the environment are being drained away. And that's going to lead us to climate change. And this is where the inequalities can be seen immediately, because we haven't taken benefit from this industrialization, and we need to make sure that our people can have food. There's obviously the land, and people want to take our land away from them, and they're leaving the poorest to become even more vulnerable, and that leads to wars that never cease. And then that leads to integrism and terrorism, and an example of this being Boko Haram around Lake Chad. This is the wealth we are talking about, and the fact that we share it creates international solidarity between the developing countries and the developed countries. We're not asking you to share with us by charity, not at all. It's ours. We didn't create that. You didn't create that wealth. You exploited nature. You're the richest, and we all know that we're the most impacted by it. So you have to help those countries to adapt. You don't need to give them money, but tools. How can you manage our natural resources in a lasting way, in a sustainable way? We protect our forests and oceans It's not going to protect just the most vulnerable. It's also going to impact the rich countries because we breathe the same air all over the world. We drink the same water because if you're talking about drinking water, we're not talking about bottled water, of course, but we have to share the tools. We have to share the technologies. This will be a way to giving us back the wealth and showing that we're human beings. The creation of work is also important. And then you've got the inequalities between the genders. A woman who works can have a PhD and all the diplomas she needs, and that's something that is important. That creates inequalities, and it also helps us to share in your wealth. So we can get over all these inequalities. We can, if we share everything out fairly. People wrote the laws, people wrote the regulations, but people have to deal with this problem because that goes way beyond laws. It's just sharing, and that's something they can do. Everybody is hungry in the developing countries, and we're all human beings. And I think if everybody benefits from the process, we'll leave a cleaner planet for the future generation. But first of all, we have to take advantage of that as well. Well, thank you very much indeed for having reminded us that the sharing out of the wealth in Africa was not optimal, and that is a euphemism. You're the last speaker. You're a barrister, and you're a business attorney, actually. And I think with you, we can come back to the responsibility of the companies and the role they have to play. I'd like to make two comments as an introduction. The first is that the title has the word fight in it, and that's not neutral. And we don't want to anchor things in an ideological debate, but it's rather difficult. If you try and understand what wealth is, well, we've understood that wealth is money. There are natural wealths as well, such as drinking water, gas, oil, and so on, arable land, and natural resources. And these resources have to be shared. First of all, let me talk about the current situation, then I'll give you a few figures, and you'll see that the concentration of wealth is not that bad. What is more difficult, however, is the extreme concentration of wealth. And I'd say that there is a solution. Law can probably deal with that problem. First of all, let's take a look at the current situation. Oxfam is an international confederation, and it's 1995 report, which was titled More and More Wealth for People Who Already Have Everything. And as you know, the rich people held 44% of the wealth of the world. Now they have 49%. 80% of the world population shares 5.5% of the world's heritage. That is, say, about 3,850 euros per adult. In 2016, an article was written indicating the figures that I quoted earlier, and the poorest have 8 billion less than they did in 2010, and at the same time, the richest have over 500 billion more. The figure should be at 0. That would be perfect equality, and when it's 1, it's already unequal. And in 30 years, the inequalities have increased in the rich countries. When we talk about concentration of wealth, there's necessarily a very pejorative connotation there, because the accumulation of wealth is not always legal. And if it isn't legal, then we need to fight against it. But the second question is this wealth, has this wealth really been accumulated? And that's more of an ethical problem. It means, is the concentration of wealth good or bad? At a certain level of concentration of wealth, it's not that bad. That's what the FMI said in 2015 in its report. It said, well, it's a necessary ill, as Didier was saying earlier. It means that you can do well in some areas. It pushes people to compete to get higher in the social scale. And along the same logic, Robert Barrault said that inequalities could be determinant in the emerging regions because it enabled some to get together enough capital to create a company which was going to have an impact on the local economy. What Didier said was that the little rivers effect is good because the revenue is re-injected by reinvestment, and directly or indirectly that's going to benefit employment and economy in general. But it's not the concentration fact that's the problem, it's how we use that concentration. If it's wealth that is used for economic development, for taking risks and creating wealth for all, in some ways it's not negative. But what does perhaps raise issues is the extreme concentration of wealth. And here the OECD is quite clear. It can have negative impact on economic growth, and it can have serious political consequences as well. It can create social tension when there's too much difference between rich and poor. Obviously, some people feel that it's unjust and may challenge some of the democratic systems. And that's the case when there are a class of people who are ultra-rich and no longer play their role and reinvest the money because they're disconnected from reality. So in the face of this, can we set a ceiling level for wealth, beyond which the concentration is unacceptable? Well, that's rather difficult to say, but when there is one person who can act individually against the interests of a state who's in charge of the general interest, then that may raise issues. When there's a hedge fund that speculates on state money, that's quite clearly a demonstration that one individual can act against the general interests. On the contrary to a ceiling, can you set a floor, a minimum level of deconcentration? Well, you can, that's clear. It's the level that will enable people to live with dignity in the area they live in. In the face of this, to find the right concentration of wealth, what can you do? Well, law can help you here. Obviously, one way of proceeding is taxation. States use that method and they abuse of it sometimes, but it's a means and a lever that has its limitations. That's to say that the state spends 1,900 billion euros a day. If you decide to spoliate the richest in France, you won't even be able to make ends meet. So the market is regulated by law, and in some areas you need to offer encouragements for fair trade, for example, by rebalancing the relationships. You have education, teaching, research for those who need it. And if you go towards the more developed countries, what you need to emancipate and to rise in the social scale, well, you need to have access to everything digital to start with. And another trend for law is to responsibilize those who are the richest, make them accountable for what they do. They lack legal and economic reflection there's a lack of legal reflection on responsibilization for this category of people. And you can always encourage laws to rebalance things. There has been a law in France that's enabled us to create organizations of general interest. That's highly developed also in the US, and should continue with the Bill Gates Foundation. And it's a way of redistributing wealth as well. Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed for that. I don't know if you want to add to what you've said or whether you have any questions. Can't see who's got a question because because of the light, I'm afraid. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, first of all, for your talks. I have a question for Madame Indo Ibrahim. Thank you very much indeed for what you said. I found that it was really rooted in reality. And my question concerns the fact that you're a founding member of the Pearl Women of Chad. If I've understood you rightly, what motivates the association is cultural issues. And if I've understood, you then developed towards women's equality, economic issues, and climatic change. And I wanted to know how you linked, what connection you have with culture, because I'm sure that's one of the prime motivations of your association. Yes. Well, thank you for the question. Yes, the motivation was also based on inequality, and I was very fortunate to go to school, which is not the case of a lot of people in my community. You can really count the number on one hand. The fact that I went to school made me feel discriminated because the other knew that I came from a village, and all that enabled me to go up the social scale. So I was fortunate. But what happened to the other girls and boys in my community who didn't go to school, who were discriminated every day? And that's what motivated me to engage in what I'm doing. So culturally speaking, we are not talking about protecting rights. We want to just go beyond discrimination and show them that we have a lot to bring to the community, even if you don't go to school. And you can protect the environment to start with, because we depend on that environment. It's the environment that makes us what we are, and we owe the environment respect. And that's what culturally and naturally is connected. Everything's related as far as we are concerned. We have to protect it because it's our culture. Protecting the environment, the fauna, the flora, all our intangible wealth, what we have on Earth, is important for us. We are connected to that very naturally, and we're connected to that through the language we speak. Culturally, our language is very rich because it enables us to know all the names of this intangible wealth and protect it. So for me, there's a natural connection between the two. It's quite normal. We can't really even think about talking about one without the other. It's something very, very cultural. And I'd like to end by saying that when we talk about the objectives for the millennium and fair sharing and all that, we have the environmental pillars, the social pillars, and the economic pillars. But we're fighting as people to have the cultural pillars for all this, because they're also very important to support sustainable development. We have the language and the practices, and beyond that, we but unfortunately we are in a different world from you, and it's very difficult to make this efficient. Does anybody else have a question? Good morning. Agnès Loud from the Théâtre Antoine Vides. I'm part of Aix-Marseille University. I must be one of the very few cultural people in the room. I'd like to say something now because I'm very interested in the subject of concentration. There's a concentration in cultural circles as well, which raises issues because you need less people, more competence, and more competitiveness, which in the theatre too. So I'd like to attract your attention to other sectors, because wealth is not just money. The model is something that is coming into the public sector as well, all of a sudden, and that raises issues. And I'd like to react to the last pathway that you mentioned on private foundations, because we hear a lot about the Bill Gates Foundation. I do know of them. But I'm in a community where the allocation of money is not the same. When we ask the representatives of the state and the nation, or the local elected representatives in France in particular, for cultural reasons, as this lady said, the foundations could give us the possibility of having some sponsoring, and I'd like to remind you that sponsoring does give tax relief to companies. There are political choices to be made, of course. But I'd just like to warn you, yes, money is redistributed. There are wonderful people in these foundations, but as our American colleague said, the director of the Orchestra of Brittany has an American director, and he's warning us that American practices are now coming to France in the cultural area as well. I'm afraid that was a bit long and rambling, but I just wanted to warn you about all this to open the debate. Well, you've opened the debate, but I think it's already been opened wide by some of the comments we heard. Wealth is not always tangible. It can be intangible as well. We talk about natural resources are very unequally spread out over our world, but they belong to everybody. They belong to all the inhabitants of the planet, who should try and share them in harmony without creating wars. Culture is a wealth, of course. And what I'm attempted to say, too, is that we often appreciate wealth. We put a figure on it on the basis of methods that are well known today, such as GDP and others. And reflection and think tanks are held. But is that the only criteria? I think that perhaps, as somebody said, you could factor in happiness as well, because wealth is not perceived only through the quantitative criterion, and it's something that you can see today. We are querying what we do in terms of developing our economies. We're saying, oh, well, it's very curious. A few years ago, we had a growth rate in the Western world that was 4 to 5%. Today, we're below 2, 1.6, 1.7, and we're happy about when it's at that. And we have the feeling that there's so much innovation around. There's so much new technology around that we maybe don't have the right tools. Wealth can't be reduced to just material wealth. It's perhaps just we haven't got the right tools to measure it. And for everything that concerns culture today, we have to use something else. To come back to a subject that's very down to earth on how wealth should be distributed. In our country today, for example, we have a country in which for traditional and cultural and historical reasons, the words equality and justice have a strong meaning for us. And that's probably why we have a redistribution rate which is considerably higher than the mean. Recently, somebody said that I think it's 38% in America, it's 48% in Europe, and in France it's 58%. In some of the programs, we've imagined decreasing it a little, but it'll only be by 1 or 2 points. But even so, do we feel that with this level of redistribution, the French are happier than most other countries in Europe? If I'm to believe some of the polls, I don't feel that that is the case at all. It's probably due to the fact that we haven't succeeded, even with this high rate of redistribution, to attain the goals that we set in terms of redistributing wealth and happiness. I think we could perhaps take just one more question. I just wanted to add that I can't pass any judgment on cultural policy because it's not my area of expertise. But the debate on foundations, between foundations and companies, I'm part of a family group. And you could say that we're extremely rich because it's one of the biggest groups in America on paper. But in actual fact, they pay a lot less dividend than the market. The family is very rich. It's a big food-producing group in the world. But the company itself should be able to create wealth. It's a sort of opposite position to Bill Gates. Bill Gates says, I made my fortune for years and years, and now I've got a lot of money, and I'm going to redistribute it. Our point of view is to say the company itself should be able to redistribute as long as it exists, and through its business to have a business model that enables us to distribute money and have an impact on some forms of capital. We're not an NGO, of course, but here again, we do have a philosophy. Let's take the GAFAs as an example. Can we pass a moral judgment on that? I don't know, but I've got an iPhone like everybody else has. What is an innovation? It's a temporary monopoly. It enables you to get a lot of wealth together very quickly, but what do you do with it afterwards? From our point of view, useful capital is capital that's reinvested. It's reinvested in a formula that enables you to create value for society, not just financial value or return on capital. So for this debate on companies and foundations, there's surely something very interesting to dig deeper into in the future. The idea that you just accumulate for 20 years and then redistribute after needs looking at closer, I feel.
So if you'll allow me, there's a very well-known foundation, that is behind one of the major French companies, and this company actually pays out dividends to this foundation that sends drugs all across the country. So, I mean, it's the same. Yes, it's the same type of model, absolutely. And this actually, the two models are not incompatible one with the other.
And there's two things that I think unite us that we haven't really talked about, and that's why we're here today and we're able to debate and we're able to talk about things, is because rather than just redistribution, I like to think of it as pre-distribution. The two most important things being human capital or education, so you can understand what's going on, and health, physical well-being, so that you can participate and continue. And I think those are two of the most important things to understand culture and choices and so forth. And I do applaud most nations that believe that these are important things that everyone should have. they should be universal goods. Even in my country, education's universal good. Of course, healthcare is not, and we have a big mess, but at least education is. And so I think those things are part of what allows us to compete, to do well, to think about what we're doing, to consider the environment and so forth. So those are perhaps the two most important. And I must say there in Africa, the Gates people are doing a good job. I mean, they've done a good job in health, at least. Not so much in women's education as they could have, but in terms of HIV and in terms of, yes, malaria and so forth, I think they've done well. And that's good, and I think that's important because the countries haven't done that. So I just wanted to add that. I think those two things aren't really redistribution, they're pre-distribution. They allow people to compete, understand, and as you know, with dignity, exercise their own preferences. That's all, folks.
Okay, effectivement, that's all.
Yes, that's all, as you said. So, Hippolyte, I think the time has come for your concluding remarks. There's one quick question. Yes? Go ahead. The very last question. Yeah. A question to Mrs. Ibrahim. I'd like to know, in your native language, how do you say climate change? So the second thing I wanted to say about culture, I mean, this is fundamental, of course. I thought that, you know, if there was not a cultural objective, because there was an institution at the United Nations looking after that with the UNESCO in the Millennium Goals, and something else that wasn't touched upon is this concentration of wealth. I was wondering, you know, what was the use and the dangers of using it. I mean, we know about the giving pledge of Bill and Melinda Gates, and that has an incredible success. I mean, you know, they're extremely powerful, and so. And, you know, again, you know, what they're doing has much more impact than the United Nations or the European Union. And yes, they can do a lot of good across the world, but they're without any control. There's no control over them. And I'd like to know whether, perhaps from a legal standpoint, isn't this perhaps, you know, is this not perhaps a danger, you know, when you have people who actually hold on to so much wealth? For us, the technical words that are, you know, that are the buzzwords, we don't care at all. It's the inner meeting. This is what we say. The change of ecosystems. We look at everything globally, and as regards the cultural aspect, you know, regarding the Millennium Goals, there's no objective about this. But we have the UNESCO that already has passed a convention on a material cultural convention that exists, but you know, and yes, we're back to talking about inequalities, as the UNESCO is poor compared to other like the UNEP and others. So we're not given the means to promote the implementation of this convention. There's other conventions on languages, and that they should be highlighted. But this is so again, here we have concentration of wealth in certain of the United organs between one another. But to finish off, what is it, a correct distribution, and how? So, you know, through foundations, institutions, establishments. No, we can't. We shouldn't just be identifying the needs of people when you don't live with them, when you're not aware of realities. I mean, you can't just, you know, come over to my country and say, in Africa, we know that people are poor and they don't have access to proper health care and drugs. They don't have access to drinking water. So I'm going to come to a village and come and actually, you know, build a well. So, okay, guys, I have a good news I'm going to share with you. I'm going to actually put in a pump, water pump. But we don't need water there. That's not our priority. Our priority, it may be education. You know, thanks for being so charitable. we need to change this trend. We're going to share, already, seeing to come up with ideas. But you have to be close to these people, listen to them. What is it that they actually need? Maybe they already have water pumps that they haven't repaired, or maybe it'll cost. They have other ways of getting water because, all the work, we can actually repair something at a very low cost and short time frame, and that can help them. Maybe they don't need water. Maybe they need education. And, where you want to have actually a water pump, this is a place, that actually has a cultural meaning for these people, and they want to have the water pump perhaps north or south of this point. That's the trend that needs to be changed. And on how we see wealth, and by listening to these people, and people that are called vulnerable or poor, and ask them, what is it that you want, so as to actually take into account your dignity. Is it about cash? No, it's about reconstructing this the trust and solidarity between human beings. And I think we're going to see great changes. And we're not going to be talking about the other guy is richer because he has 45 billion, or Bill Gates has 180 billion dollars. We couldn't care less. So what's important for us is this human relationship. Thank you.
Thank you for not asking me that question, because my country has defined away climate change. It doesn't exist. My president said it doesn't exist. That's why you need education, so you can understand.
Pour moi, j'ai la triste tâche de devoir.
So again, now my turn to actually make the closing remarks. So this extremely rich debate. I think everybody's against wealth concentration. I mean, we're focusing on wealth, and so we tend to focus on what we can measure. And as we are economists, and as many people in the panel said, there are other dimensions when we talk about inequalities that can be just as important. So once the increase of wealth concentration, when it leads to more inequalities on the other dimensions, but as you mentioned, on deterioration of natural resources, on also impoverishment of the cultural wealth. That's why it's an important indicator. We shouldn't just be focusing on financial wealth. So, of course, I'm not going to reiterate everything said. Tim Smeating said, so if there's growth, concentration is not seen as such a negative outlook. Loïc Moutot, you said, nevertheless, there's responsibility on the part of the company. The company is responsible to invest properly and to use its capital intelligently. Alexis, you told us that law can help, and that the de jure state is important because it can help us obtain something that is fairer. And Didier Kling, each one of you said a lot, so it's difficult to recap everything in so little time. And I've been told that I've actually gone over my time. So the 1% doesn't mean anything. Okay, these yes, it actually sounds good and very media. This is what one reads in the media and makes the headlines. And Indu, you're right to tell us not to just look at the 1%, but look at the poorer people, and you've explained how important it is to preserve dignity, how important education it is, and this was said over and over again. I'd like to conclude by saying in France as well, I mean, if you measure poverty, it's not relative poverty as we tend to do it. I mean, real poverty, people who don't have access to what is essential to live, that make it possible to actually have one's role in society and to have access to a better life and better living conditions, things that are just very straightforward. How many people don't have a full meal every other day in France? What is the percentage of people who don't actually go off who don't leave their home for 1 week's holiday? vacation, and the people who actually accumulate different disadvantages. They don't have television, they don't have a telephone. So these people represent 4.5% of the population in France. It's still much too many. Over the last 5 years, we haven't seen a reduction of these 4.5%. If we actually look at who these people are, I agree with you. You have to see who it is we're talking about, and not just look at the high net worth individuals. Very often it's single mothers and these children who are not going to have the capacity of playing a role in a role. They're going to always be the pariah, and I didn't know this word in French, Tim, so I'm going to translate. So let's call it pre-distribution. Let's open up the possibilities for everyone to have access to a better life, to a life with dignity. This is, I think, the take-home message, even if many other things have been said. I know there were still many other questions. I know that there's some frustration because some people haven't been able to ask your questions. I'm thanking the panelists. I'd like to thank the audience. And don't hesitate to come and talk with us once we've finished with this roundtable. And thank you, Sabine, for having moderated the debate. Thank you.